why rely on the nations that God will hold accountable, rather than, relying on God himself? That's kind of the underlying point there. Chapter 24 begins sort of a new section that really is more apocalyptic. It actually kind of takes us backwards. It takes us back to some of the themes that were encountered back earlier in Isaiah chapter 2. And it has to do with universal judgment, as well as eventually Zion itself, the hill of Jerusalem itself, becoming sort of the worship center of the world, right? Where eventually the nations, if you remember the imagery we encountered in Isaiah 2, where the nations were streaming upwards, right? So you kind of had this reverse kind of river imagery where the nations were streaming upwards to the mountain. This mountain specifically is Zion, Jerusalem's hill, which obviously in that frame of reference is speaking about the temple itself, right? But not just the old temple, but the new one that will be constructed. Um, um, in a person, it's constructed in a person. Let me just phrase that less by being some kind of pre-trib dispensation. So anyway, um, but now when we get to chapter 24, 24 itself is now this begins. Going to respond. And so you have this kind of play on singing, right? Singing becomes something here that is typically done with amusement, celebrations, merriment, those kinds of things. But there's a play here on understanding singing. I know that in our context, we think of singing, very different. But before the world of before the world of digital music and whatever song, whatever genre that you wanted at any time and things like that. Songs in the past, you only heard singing if someone could do what? Play this, right? Or they could sing. It's very, very limited on occasions and those kinds of things. And those occasions were typically done, in response to specific events. There were celebrations, it was, maybe, banquets or, receptions or whatever other kind of things that were going on where you had that kind of those kinds of things. But so what happens is you begin to see over these 4 chapters is a theme in which the way singing kind of changes. It goes from amusement to mourning into a different kind of song, right? That's even picked up by the book of Revelation itself, right? That those who belong to Christ will sing a new song in a new creation. So these kinds of themes begin to kind of carry over, right? So the first one is so the first one is in chapter 24, which deals with universal judgment. So we'll start there. And again, you'll see why when I talk about universal, because the only city that's ever named in this chapter is Jerusalem. It's in the last verse. It's in verse 23. Until then, there is no specific city or specific place that's named. So it speaks of this in the Bible kind of chat through it. So the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, the servant like his master, the maid like her mistress, the buyer like the seller, the lender like the borrower, and the creditor like the debtor. The earth will be completely laid waste, completely spoiled, because the Lord has spoken this word. The earth mourns, it withers, it will fades. It withers, the results of the people of the earth fade away. The earth is ruined by those who live in it, because they've transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore, those who live on the earth are burned, and few men are left. The new wine mourns, the vine decays, the good of heart, they are sighing. The gaiety of tambourines, they cease. The noise of revelers stops. The gaiety of harps cease. They do not drink wine with strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. The city of of chaos is broken down. Every house is shut up so that when they enter, there's an outcry in the streets concerning the wine, and all the joy is turned into gloom. And the gaiety of the earth has vanished. Desolation is left in the city, and the gate is battered to ruins. For thus it will be in the midst of the earth among the peoples, like like shaking an olive tree, or the gleanings when the grape harvest. Behold, right? Behold the Lord. So there's an automatic sort of it's an address that is meant to be something that almost it sounds imminent. It sounds like it's about to happen at any moment, right? But then this becomes very typical of eschatological language, language of speaking to future kind of judgment events like this. And what's interesting is, so it's behold in the sense of, it's imminent and it's meant to grab your attention. And then you have these devastating words, right? The Lord lays the earth to waste, right? And there's an interesting sort of word plays that are going on. In fact, look with me in verse 10 for just a moment. How is verse 10? Somebody read just the top, the beginning, or somebody just read verse 10 for us.
The wasted city is broken down. Every house is shut up so that no one can enter.
Wasted city. Anybody have something different besides wasted? City of confusion. Anything else? City of chaos. Yeah. It was just interesting. Do you guys remember in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And it says, and the earth was what? Remember?
No.
What? The word formless there, that's the word here that's used for confusion or chaos. So what you almost have is like Isaiah is presenting judgment here is almost like a decreation aspect. That makes sense? It's kind of undoing creation. Jeremiah would do the same thing later. Jeremiah actually has a section where he actually reverses the entire creative order. I mean, that goes all the way back to the point of its formlessness, right? So you have this sense of judgment. It's very much alike the way the New Testament would use the word world, okay? In the sense that it is speaking both sometimes about the dirt, but at the same time, it's speaking about the earth's systems, right? Its operations, right? Its human population and its corruption by them. So Isaiah is using this word in two forms. One, that the chaos or the tohu in Hebrew, the undoing aspect of the earth is through two things. One is humanity's sin, and the other is because of God's judgment. Both of these, this chaos and confusion is created by both of these things. Okay, why? Well, because you think about it. What was it that God established humanity to do? Humanity was to
Reign over his creation.
manage his creation, to bring order. There was Adam and Eve's job, humanity's job was to keep doing the work that God had begun, right? God is the one who established order, he separated things, he created, and humanity's job was to image and reflect God through continually bringing that kind of order to his creation. Sin, instead, you keep seeing this language in verses 1 through 13, where it's a constant language of sin has spoiled us, right? In fact, to be honest with you, Gene, you'll appreciate this. The actual word there in verse 5, the earth is polluted. It's actually a word for sewage. I mean,
You'll appreciate it.
so Isaiah is basically saying the earth, because of humanity's sin, has become like one giant trailer park septic tank, right? But also, but instead, there's not, um, instead of order, there's confusion. And instead of the earth, and instead of being able to, experience enjoyment and the fruit of God's presence, and instead sin has created, and it's completely spoiled, it's devastated, it's ruined God's work. And so you have both kind of things going on here. One is the earth is being tohu'd, it's being, there's a creation reversal here because of one part, it's humanity's sin. The other part is God's judgment, acts of judgment himself, right? Why do we say God's act of judgment himself? Because one of the things that's really interesting about these verses is that there are connections back to the flood narrative. So, for example, in chapter 24, in verse 5, the earth is spoiled, it's ruined by those who live in it because they transgressed laws, violated statutes, and broke the everlasting covenant. The only other word to really have everlasting covenant actually comes from Genesis. It comes from Genesis 9:16. And so on top of that, when you look down in look at verse 18 for just a moment. Skip down to chapter 24, verse 18. Then it will be that he who flees the report of disaster will fall into the pit. The one who climbs out of the pit, there will be caught with snare. For the windows above are open and the foundations of the earth shake. You see that language? That's language from Genesis 7:11. Okay, that's from the flood narrative itself, right? On top of that, you have lots of stuff in here about planting and vineyards and stuff like that and whatnot. And what was one of the last scenes you saw of Noah's life? Noah's life here that speaks of a universal judgment that came in the past with respect to Noah's era. On top of that, you also have an undoing of the earth as well. It's been created by human sin, right? So keeping those kinds of things in balance, right? As we go through that. So notice what he says in verse 2. This is something that's so important. Verse 2, and the people will be like the priest, the servant like the master, the mate like mistress, buyer like seller, and so forth. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're a billionaire and you can afford to place bunkers in the ground. It doesn't matter what your status is. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how much you have. This at this point, when God begins to judge, it's the great equalizer. It doesn't matter. Everyone's accountable. And there's no amount of money, there's no amount of shelter, there's no amount of status, there's no position that can protect you from this. And so it's really interesting. Basically, Isaiah uses this language. And by the way, Isaiah, everything about chapter 24, it's structured more like a poem. It's all about imagery. He's just provoking our imagination through seeing these kind of things. He's just basically showing that everyone just left. Everyone is just level. Everyone has the exact same status when it comes to the day that God's going to judge, right? Verse 3, the earth is completely laying waste. It's going to be spoiled. Why? Because God is spoken. So, I mean, nothing. In other words, it's interesting. Let's think about the chapters we just came from. If Assyria is knocking at the door, out of this one. Does that make sense? Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, there's no amount of lawyers that you can hire to get yourself out of this one, right? But it's very important, right? Because and think about it. So many of us, I remember, confession here. Okay? I remember as a kid, first of all, my heart was so dark. Before I became a Christian, man, I was a good liar. And I can convince anybody. Hey, I saw what you married, so we know you're good. Exactly. Silver tongued devil, what you are. My Gene Rao. But the thing is, I mean, it was one of those things like Steve was talking about, people that would try to convince you that. But man, I could actually get away with things. And it's like almost like whenever I found myself like in a bind or whatever, like I could figure out a way to I can negotiate my way out of something, right? But just that kind of that simple tendency that was in there, But that's what I love about these words in verse 3. It's like that kind of even for the one who's a skilled negotiator and a way of being able to manipulate things, to be able to steer things in their direction, even their ability to do that will be. That's what. So in other words, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's very powerful. Verse 4, the earth mourns and withers and withers, and the exalt of the people of the earth take away. And then this is exactly what's being said here. And the earth, verse 5, is polluted. It's like sewage. It has just run down the earth. Why? Three things. They transgressed the laws, broken statutes, violated statutes, and broke the everlasting covenant. In other words, Isaiah is speaking here very much like what Paul would speak in Romans chapters 1 through 3, where he's describing how people have rejected exactly the law that God's placed on conscience, and they've rejected the universal truths that God's established in the created order, right? And then he moves on talking about how just Gentiles in chapter 2 are guilty, so are the Jews guilty. And then in chapter 3 in Romans, he says what? All the world's guilty, right? Everyone, none can escape this. In other words, every single human being has broken God's covenant law. It doesn't matter whether you're an Israelite and you know specifically what came down from the mountain. It doesn't matter because the pagan on the other side of the world also knows there is established moral order, and there's also a moral law that's ingrained on the conscience. And God says everyone's guilty because everyone's broken the covenant in several lives. So this is very, very similar to Romans 1 through 3. And so that's what he means by this everlasting covenant. And he's actually, if you think about it, this is one of the reasons why this goes all the way back to Genesis. Because what is it when Noah gets off the boat with his family? You have the repeating of things that were said in Genesis chapter 1, right? Because he says to Noah and his family, be fruitful and multiply. You see this language coming again, right? And so you have, in other words, it's a restart. In other words, that the laws that were established in general here did not go away with the flood. They're still there, and all of humanity. No, you say that you did the same thing happened here. Exactly right. Exactly, which is the point, right? And listen, and it is the point. You can destroy every single thing on this earth, but one family and just cannot get rid of more. Put that in perspective for a moment. Mhm. This whole idea that people can change themselves, reform themselves, do better. And here you have an example where God wipes away everything on the earth but a few animals and one family, and it still couldn't solve the problem. It doesn't change the corruption of the human heart. Yeah. So, verse 6, therefore a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. And therefore everyone who lives on the earth will burn, and few men are left. And what an interesting statement. One of the most powerful questions that Jesus ever asked is in Luke chapter 18, verse 8, when he says, when the Son of Man returns, will he indeed find faith on earth? That's a pretty powerful question. And in here you have Isaiah speaking the same thing. Oh, a few men. Few.
So Jason, was Luke.
And so now here you have this sort of this imagery. I don't know, like my mind when I read this imagery, I think of places like Machu Picchu, right, in Peru, right, with these like ancient cities, that were like. mourns, the vine decays. What, somebody read the next phrase they have. The NASB has the merry-hearted sigh. You know, it's actually, it's actually in Hebrew, it's actually called the good of heart. It doesn't mean that doesn't mean bless your heart, right? It's an idiom that's used for those who are drunk. Okay? So it's saying, so the new wine mourns, the vine decays, and the drunk sigh, is what he's saying. But look here, the rejoicing or the gaiety of the tambourines, they cease, the noise of the revelers stop, the harps, all the laughter with the harp, it ceases. They do not drink wine with song, and strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. I mean, in other words, you have what back up. Part of the imagery here is an imagery of kind of after the harvest. So look, once the harvest is completed, the hard work of all of that stops. And so before the plowing and all those things begin again for the late fall and winter, there was always a harvest celebrations that took place, for most agricultural societies. And it was a time where everybody broke up with a new wine. People had a little bit, everybody got, they had to break out the tipsy transits, because of this, people had way too much going on. They had way too much to drink. And, excellent. Yeah, exactly. Hey, it's enough about the sewage, okay? Yeah. But all of a sudden, all the festivities and all the bars are closed. You know what I'm saying? No one's drinking and having fun.
All the Germans went home.
It's all gone, okay? The pubs are closed. So all this now, but look, even and strong drink at the end of verse 9 is bitter to those who drink it. In other words, if they're drinking now, they're drinking because they're trying to escape or they're trying to forget.
Yeah.
The drinking has turned from rejoicing at the end of a harvest to now it's become nothing but mourning because there is no harvest. There's nothing to it anymore. And I've heard me quote Francis Schaeffer on this so many times, but he was so spot on in the 1960s when he said that people who can't explain reality, they just look to escape reality. And this is the reason why, in so many ways, you see the things you see in our culture today. When you lose an explanation of the world around you, when you lose explanations of how to make sense of reality, the only thing left to do is to numb yourself to reality and just get away from it. Because it is easier to be in a drunken stupor, easier to be high, easier to be engaged in something. And by the way, I would put, shopping and pornography and all kinds of other things into this category too. And entertainment and binge watching, Netflix or whatever it may be. There's all kinds of things that people do in order to try to escape the reality. What about else thing? Hey. It can't, anything can become addictive and so that none can enter. There's an outcry in the streets. Look at this, verse 11. There's an outcry in the streets concerning the wine. Here's what's crazy. They're crying out for the wine. You know why? Because they missed the days. Missed the days where we could just have joy and laughter and drink and everything was kind of good. Now they're crying out for the wine to be wine because it's not there. Now the strong drink has become bitter because it's misery about having to face the wrath of God. Now, turns to gloom. The gaiety of the earth, the rejoicing of the earth is banished, and the gate is battered to ruins, and thus it will be in the midst of the earth among the peoples. And he says, and so he uses this imagery of shaking an olive tree and gleanings of the grape when the grape harvest is over. Most of us living in South Georgia, we know what a pecan tree shaker is, right? And you think about when it hooks up to that tree and it shakes that tree. And what he's saying here is it's doing the same thing with an olive. In other words, it's shaking the tree. And the only thing that's going to be left, here again, this is that imagery of remnant again. The only thing that will be left will be like the few olives still remaining on the tree after it's been shaken, or a few grapes still left on the vineyard after it has been ripped. That's what this is going to look like. You think about a cotton field, right? When the cotton picker goes through it, right? There's always still those remnants that kind of hang out there. Have you ever done what I've done and ever thought, well, I'm going to run it back through there one more time? Just a lot of cotton. It's not worth it, right? That's right. It's a business decision because that little 10% hanging out there is not worth running all that equipment just to go back through it, right? But you get the imagery of what's going on here. It's like what will be left is after the shaking and after the picking of God's judgment. You're looking for comfort. This is not exactly the passage of good. Look at verses 14, 15, and 16 are probably some of the hardest verses in Isaiah. In fact, it's kind of interesting. The Hebrew versions versus the Greek Old Testament and the Aramaic versions, that all three try to say something a little bit different because it's a very challenging text. But I think we kind of get here with what's going on. It's difficult, but it seems to be that probably the best way to explain verses 14 through 16 is it's almost like the other people in the world are rejoicing over the judgment of the city of chaos. So the city of chaos, so, well, what city is that? It's representative. It's representative of the world system itself, right? It's kind of like, yeah, I'll give you an example. Hold your place here, guys. Turn to Revelation chapter 11. Just a moment. Let's look at the Bible, chapter 11, real quick. Two places there in Isaiah. Don't forget. So Revelation 11, let me give you a great passage that helps to understand how the Bible will use representative cities, okay? So this is speaking of the two witnesses. I don't have time to talk through all that. I just want to read these verses to you. But speaking of the two witnesses, and they are killed by the world. But in Revelation chapter 11, verse 7, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss, that's in Isaiah 24 as well, will make war with them and overcome them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically or spiritually is called
Rebellion. Sodom and Egypt.
So let's break this down. Verse 8. Their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city. What's the great city in this part of the world? John was right.
Rome.
Rome. Which spiritually is called what?
Sodom.
Represents what? Sexual immorality to a degree, right? And Egypt, which represented what?
Oppression and slavery.
Right? Where also the Lord was crucified, which is Jerusalem. So my point is, in that one verse, you got how many cities that are represented here? Four. And all four of them speak to something different, right? With respect to an empire, to immorality, to slavery, and and apostasy, right? All four of these are mentioned in one. So I use that to go back to Isaiah now, but the reason I use that is because when Isaiah is speaking about the great city, he's speaking about it in this kind of term. It's a city that represents sort of all corruption, that's representative across the world. Does that make sense? And so verse 14, they raise their voices, they shout for joy, they cry out from the sea. I know your Bible will probably say west, concerning the majesty of the Lord. Therefore, glorify the Lord in the light of lights from the east. The name of the Lord, the God of Israel, in the coastlands of the sea. From the ends of the earth we hear songs, glory to the righteous one. But I say, woe to me, alas for me. The treacherously, the treacherously, where those who are witnessing, this is very, very similar to how John uses this in the book of Revelation, where people will witness the fall of Babylon, right? Babylon becoming representative of, the greatness of the empires, or the greatest sense of source of rebellion against God. There's a sense in which the oppressed of the world, those who have been oppressed by Rome, oppressed by Babylon, oppressed by those kingdoms, there's a sense in which they are watching from a distance and they're rejoicing. They're glad to watch this great system collapse. But it's interesting. Then all of a sudden you have in verse 15, or in verse 14 there, they raise their voices, they shout for joy. And there's the song. We'll see this again in a second. Verse 16, the word psalms there. So again, remember, you have in verses 8 and 9, you had songs that were being sung then, but songs that had disappeared, and songs of the harvest, they were gone. There's no more song. Now there is a new song here, a sense of excitement over the judgment of God. It's actually going to break the city of confusion. But then, and the cry, look at the universal language here. How many of your Bibles say in verses 14 and 15, they cry out, from the west, and in verse 15, they glorify the Lord in the east. You guys have that? Mm-hmm. So, the west there, it's actually the word for sea. In other words, they cry out from the Mediterranean, and then the east there is the light of light. So, in words, why? Because the sun rises in the east, right? So, from the farthest reaches of lights all the way to the backs of the sea, the world is actually singing and rejoicing in the song. So, there's this universal language that's being used. But then it says in verse 16, from the ends of the earth, we hear songs. So, songs are going on again, and what are songs? Heavy. In fact, the word kavod in Hebrew actually means thick, fat, or heavy. So so in other words, it's almost like when the Hebrew speaks of God's glory, it's speaking that God is weighty. There's a real substance to him. Does that make sense? There's no tolerance. And if you think about this in contrast, right? Anybody just describe somebody as like they're or you see the Bible describing people that they're boasting or their pride is just empty. There's nothing to it, right? In contrast, God's is heavy. God's is heavy because it's thick, right? It's substantive, right? So now, why is that important? Because in verse 16, from the ends of the earth we hear the songs, kavod or heavy or weighty to the righteous one. But I say, and here's a little Hebrew, leanness is mine. Mm. It's not the word woe in the sense of ho, and we typically see in Hebrew. It literally says in the Hebrew, leanness is mine. Leanness belongs to me. That's what he's saying. In other words, I love it. Lean in contrast to heavy, right? So these are set up as direct contrast in that way. So he says, why? Because the problem is still not solved. You guys are rejoicing in the city of confusion's collapse. But the problem is still not solved. The treacherous still deal treacherously. The world is still corrupt. In other words, think about Genesis 69. So you're rejoicing way too early here because and you have this repetition. It's like a despairing cry there. The treacherously still deal treacherously, very treacherous. In other words, it's kind of interesting. It's just one repetition of word, one after another. And I just want to read this next part. The rest of this makes it makes good sense to you, beginning in verse 17 here, because here becomes the ultimate problem. In other words, you're rejoicing too early, but when God's judgment comes, verse 17, terror and pit and snare, they confront you who live on the earth. Terror, pit, and a trap. That's what you have to look forward to. Verse 18, and it will come about that the one who hears of disaster, he'll try to escape, but what's going to happen? He's going to fall off it. And then the one who gets out of the pit, what's gonna happen to him? Yeah, this is kind of like the language we saw in verse 2. In verse 2, it doesn't matter what your social status is, it doesn't matter what your wealth is, everyone's equalized. And also in this verse, it doesn't matter how hard you try to escape, the reality is what? You get.
Mhm.
In verse 19, the earth is broken. Let me read this, and then I'll read it well, actually, let me read it exactly as it is in Hebrew in verse 19. Broken is broken the earth. Split is split the earth. Shaken is shaken the earth. So the earth here gets broken, it's split, it's shaken. The violence of language. But going back up to verse 18. God's not going to reflood the earth, he says, but he wants you to understand something. That the flood destruction of the earth was the most violent episode the earth has ever experienced in its history. I'm just thinking about that just a moment. Mary Elizabeth, she's supposed to be my daughter, she's taking a college class, taking geology. And so we've had some interesting conversations in the house with them. And one thing I remember we were having this conversation, and I said, honey, I said, here's the one thing that your professors are always missing, and that is that number one, you cannot replicate the violence that the earth suffered during the flood. You can't reproduce that in a laboratory. I mean, we're talking about the entire firmament around the earth itself that collapsed in, and then everything under the bottom of the earth broke open. I mean, how else do you explain the continental divide? The earth went through such a violent episode that when you talk, so when people are trying to date these things millions and billions of years or things like that, I said the one thing they always leave out is the fact that there was a flood event that happened on this earth. And it scarred and it remade the face of this earth forever. And the reason I mention that is because what Isaiah is talking about here is like, when we talk about God's judgment, there is nothing like it about this. And Isaiah is describing this, the guys, the judgment that's coming will fulfill. He says, it just as in the days of Noah, people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving. In other words, just as life was going on in the days of Noah, and all of a sudden, sudden destruction. They fall property. We ship. Oceanfront property at that point, right? But if anything, just in the last minute here, if anything, guys, there's nothing light about this, and it should say something about our own hearts when we talk about people who are non-believers and how we feel about them and our compassion on them. People that don't know Christ, there is nothing to look forward to. Talk about what they waste. And even when there is momentary relief on something, or maybe one of our enemies fall, or maybe we see maybe one day we'll see the Hamas fall, or whatever this may be, whatever. But don't be premature in your rejoicing, because the entire earth will suffer judgment, and the only ones that will escape is that remnant that realizes I can never I can never experience salvation through the righteousness of my righteousness that comes through Jesus. It's only by his deeds, his goodness, his holiness will I ever be able to escape the wrath of God that is coming. And the wrath of God that is coming is nothing lightweight. It is a wrath that is so vengeful that it will be like the days of Noah. Again, the earth will suffer absolute violence. There is nothing like it. And so those are the kind of things that we have to put our thinking about salvation and lostness in those kinds of biblical categories to make sure our hearts are stirred correctly. don't meant to be any contrast to the technical. Let's pray. So Father, thank you that in the midst of such a threat of your judgment, God, which every one of us deserve. But we thank you in the midst of that threat. We thank you, God, there is salvation. Son, Jesus Christ. Father, I feel like the Apostle Paul, and that I am chief among sinners. All of us, Lord, understand what it means to be weighed down with sin and to be caught in its snare and its trap. But God, thank you that through faith in Christ, Lord, we can escape the coming day of your wrath. But now, Lord, I also pray that you would give us great compassion for those who do not know you. I pray that we will proclaim the truth. We will speak the truth, live the truth, that our mouths and our lives will be an example and a testimony to salvation. God, give us compassion for those who don't know you. And God, give us hearts of joy, Lord, for the salvation that you've given us. In Jesus' name.